We thought there was something wrong with the criminal. But what if the real story was that the nation helped create the crime? ZeitCrimes explores the crimes that didn't just shock us. They reshaped society, power, and history itself. ZeitCrimes, crimes that changed the nation.
Before we begin, I want to be direct about what this episode contains and why I think it is worth your time. This episode includes detailed discussion of homicide, the shooting and stabbing of victims, threatening correspondence sent to police and media, and the long-term psychological impact of unsolved violent crime on surviving victims, bereaved families, and entire communities. It also discusses police failures, media complicity in a killer's publicity campaign, and the sociological conditions that shape the case's reception and legacy. The Zodiac case is, in one very specific way, different from most cases covered on this podcast. Thus far, the perpetrator has never been identified or convicted. That fact is central to everything we will discuss today, not as a mystery to be solved in the next hour, but as a structural condition that shaped the investigation, the culture around the case, and the treatment of victims and survivors in ways that demand serious examination. I will not be offering a theory about who the Zodiac was. There are dozens of those books and podcasts and documentaries already. What I am going to offer instead is a history of what actually happened, the sociology of how America processed it, and the political institutional changes that came and did not come in its aftermath. Support resources for survivors and bereaved families are listed in the show notes. December 20th, 1968, Benicia, California. The area known as Lake Herman Road is a quiet stretch outside the city, a place teenagers went to park, to talk, to be alone in the particular way that teenagers of that era needed to be alone. The road winds past industrial tanks and open ground. At night, it is almost completely dark. David Faraday is 17 years old. Betty Lou Jensen is 16. They are on their first date. David's station wagon is parked near a gate at the end of the road. At some point, another car pulls up beside them. Betty Lou Jensen is found 280 feet from the car. She has been shot 5 times in the back and a tight grouping between her shoulder blades as if she was running. David Faraday is found beside the car, shot once in the head. He dies in the ambulance. At this point, there is no name for who did this. There is no letter claiming credit. There is no cipher, no taunting phone call, no symbol drawn on a door. There are 2 dead teenagers on a dark road outside Benicia, and a police department with very few leads. The name would come later. The name would come from the killer himself. And the decision to give a serial murder a brand, to run his letters on the front page and broadcast his demands on television, would shape the next half-century of true crime in America in ways we have barely begun to reckon with. I am the host, and this is ZeitCrimes. Today we are going to talk about the Zodiac Killer. What actually happened, what it revealed about the society in which it happened, and what it changed or failed to change about how America responds to violent crime. Let's look at the historical record. California at the end of the 1960s. To understand the Zodiac case, you need to understand the world it emerged from. The late 1960s in California were a moment of extraordinary cultural intensity and extraordinary anxiety as well. The Summer of Love had happened in San Francisco in 1967. By 1968, it was over in all but name. The Haight-Ashbury district, which had been the symbolic center of the counterculture, was deteriorating. The idealism of the early decade had curdled under the weight of Vietnam, political assassination, and the recognition that peace and love were not, by themselves, a social program. The Bay Area in particular was experiencing rapid demographic change. The suburbs of Vallejo, Benicia, and Solano County were communities built on the post-war promise of safe, quiet, middle-class life. Commuter towns where families moved to raise children away from the perceived dangers of the city. San Francisco itself was more cosmopolitan, more politically charged, more racially diverse. The tension between these two Californias, the suburban and the urban, the traditional and the countercultural, runs through the Zodiac case in ways that shaped everything from media coverage to investigative priorities. Law enforcement in 1968 California was also operating under severe limitations that most people today don't really fully appreciate. Different city and county police departments operated essentially independently. There was no shared database of violent crimes. The California Department of Justice did not have a unified system for connecting homicides across various jurisdictions. The FBI was technically available for consultation, but J. Edgar Hoover's bureau was deeply preoccupied with political surveillance, with monitoring civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and the counterculture, and was slow to engage with violent crime cases in general. Into this world came a killer who understood, with either extraordinary intuition or cold calculation, how to exploit every one of those limitations. The investigation is handled by the Solano County Sheriff's Office. There is no letter taking credit, no cipher, no name. At this stage, the case is a double homicide with no identified suspect and no known motive. Police consider robbery a crime of passion and random violence. None of these leads go anywhere. Betty Lou Jensen is the youngest of the confirmed Zodiac victims. She was shot 5 times in the back as she ran from the car. David Faraday was shot once in the head at close range. The attack is professional in its lethality and leaves almost no physical evidence. The road where they were parked was used by other young people on the same evening, any of whom could have encountered the same killer. July 4th, 1969, Blue Rock Springs Park, Vallejo. 6 months and 2 weeks later, a different city, Vallejo in Solano County, but the same pattern. Darlene Ferrin, 22, and Michael Mago, 19, are parked at Blue Rock Springs Park, a recreational area near the Vallejo golf course. It is July 4th. There are fireworks going off all across the city. A car pulls up beside them, drives away, and then returns. The driver gets out and fires into the car with a flashlight in one hand to eliminate the targets. Darlene Ferrin is hit multiple times. Michael Mago is hit 4 times, but survives. Despite wounds to his face, neck, and legs, he will be one of the few surviving witnesses to the Zodiac, and his testimony will be critical and will also be complicated by the chaos and trauma of the attack. Darlene Ferrin dies at the hospital. She is 22 years old. She is a waitress, a mother, a wife. She has a daughter who is not yet 2 years old. 40 minutes after the shooting, Vallejo police receive an anonymous phone call. The caller is a man. He says calmly, "I want to report a murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." He hangs up. The call is traced to a payphone near a gas station a mile from Farron's home. The caller has just connected the Blue Rock Springs shooting to the Lake Herman Road murders. And he has done it in a way that makes clear this is not a confession made in a panic or in remorse. This is an announcement. August 1, 1969, the first letters. On August 1st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters arrived simultaneously at 3 Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contains a detailed description of the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs attacks. Details that only the investigators and the killer could know. Each letter also contains 1/3 of a 408-symbol cryptogram, which the letters claim, if decoded, will reveal the killer's identity. The letters demand front-page publication. If the newspapers refuse, the writer says he will go on a rampage this weekend. The newspapers publish the letters. The cryptogram is released publicly. Within days, a high school teacher named Donald Harden and his wife, Betty, decode the cipher. It does not reveal an identity. Instead, it reveals a rambling statement about the thrill of killing and a claim that the victims will be the writer's slaves in the afterlife. On August 7th, another letter arrives at the Examiner. This one begins, "Dear Editor, this is a Zodiac speaking." It is the first use of the name. It contains further details of the crimes to establish credibility. It is taunting, confident, and grammatically deliberate. The Zodiac has introduced himself, and from this point forward, the investigation becomes something unprecedented in American criminal history. That is, a running public correspondence between a serial killer and the press, conducted in parallel with an active murder investigation with millions of readers following along. September 27, 1969, Lake Berryessa, Napa County. Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, are students at Pacific Union College. On a warm Saturday in late September, they are picnicking on a peninsula at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. They are approached by a man wearing a black executioner-style hood with a white cross symbol drawn on the chest, the Zodiac symbol, which he had drawn on his letters. He is carrying a gun and a length of clothesline. He ties them both up. He tells them he is an escaped convict, that he needs their car and their money to go to Mexico. He stabs Brian Hartnell 6 times in the back. He stabs Cecilia Shepard 10 times. He then walks to Hartnell's car and writes on the door with a felt-tip pen the dates of the previous attacks and today's dates with the word or words "by knife." Brian Hartnell survives. Cecilia Shepard does not. She is 22 years old, a music major, a person her family and friends describe as exceptionally kind. She dies 2 days later in a hospital in Napa. This attack is significant for several reasons. It is the first time a surviving witness can describe the Zodiac's physical appearance with any detail. Hartnell describes a heavyset white male, approximately 5 feet 11 inches tall, wearing glasses beneath the hood. It is also the first attack in Napa County, demonstrating the Zodiac's deliberate use of multiple jurisdictions to complicate coordination between investigators. October 11, 1969, San Francisco. The murder of Paul Stine. Paul Stine is 29 years old. He is a San Francisco State University graduate student, driving a taxicab to support himself while working toward his degree. On the night of October 11th, he picks up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary in the Theater District. The fare directs him to Washington and Maple Streets in Presidio Heights, a wealthy residential neighborhood. At the corner, the passenger shoots Paul Stine once in the right side of the head with a 9mm pistol. He then tears a piece from Stine's shirt. He wipes down the interior of the cab with a shirt fabric. He walks away north into the Presidio. Several teenagers in a house across the street happen to witness this. They call the police. The dispatcher, in what has become one of the most discussed errors in the case, broadcasts a description of the suspect as a black male. This was entirely incorrect. The witnesses had described a white male, and it means that when two officers stop a man matching the actual description walking near the Presidio, shortly after the murder, they are told the suspect they are looking for is black, and they let him go. They describe the encounter afterward, and the description matches witnesses' descriptions of the Zodiac. Paul Stine's murder is the only Zodiac killing confirmed to have occurred within San Francisco city limits. It brings the San Francisco Police Department formally into the investigation alongside Vallejo PD, the Napa County Sheriff, and Solano County. The coordination between these agencies will remain troubled throughout. October 1969, the Stine letters and the first crisis. On October 13th, the 2 days after Paul Stine's murder, a letter arrives at the San Francisco Chronicle. It includes a piece of Paul Stine's blood-soaked shirt. The letter taunts police for their failure to catch the writer and threatens to shoot school children as his next targets. It warns parents not to let their children ride school buses. The threat to children produces immediate public panic. School districts in the Bay Area consider closing. Police are assigned to bus routes. The Zodiac has demonstrated that he understands the leverage points of a media-saturated society. Threatening children produces a response orders of magnitude greater than threatening adults. On October 22nd, a caller contacts a San Francisco television station and reaches attorney Melvin Belli, who is participating in a live call-in program about the Zodiac. The caller, who may or may not have been the Zodiac, this has never really been established, says his name is Sam, says he has headaches and asks for help. Belli converses with him on live television for several minutes. The call is never conclusively attributed to the Zodiac. October 1969 is a moment when the Zodiac case becomes something more than a murder investigation. It becomes or evolves into a media event, a public crisis, a cultural phenomenon, and the decisions made in those weeks by newspapers, by police departments, by television stations, about how to respond to the killer's correspondence will have consequences that extend for decades. 1970, the letters continue, the attacks appear to stop. Through 1970, the Zodiac continues to send letters, though the confirmed murders do not continue at the same rate. The letters are taunting, cryptic, and they are escalating in apparent grandiosity. He claims in a March 1971 letter to have killed 17 people by now. The confirmed body count at this point is actually 5. Whether the additional 12 claimed victims are real, fictional, or a mixture has never been established. A letter in April 1970 includes a bomb diagram and a threat to blow up a school bus. Letters make reference to Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta, The Mikado, specifically to the character Coco's little list of people who won't be missed. The Zodiac's version substitutes little list with the list of people he intends to kill, including those he describes as wiggly people and small things. These letters are simultaneously chilling and bizarre, and a mixture of grandiosity, dark humor, and operational threat makes them extraordinarily difficult to assess. Are they the genuine communications of a man who is escalating toward more violence? Are they the work of someone who has decided the correspondence itself is more satisfying than further killing? Are they partially fabricated? Investigators at the time had no reliable framework for answering any of these questions. The potentially linked cases of Cheri Jo Bates and Kathleen Johns. Two additional cases have been seriously linked to the Zodiac by investigators and researchers, though neither has been definitively confirmed. Cheri Jo Bates was 18 years old when she was murdered at Riverside College on October the 30th, 1966, more than 2 years before the first confirmed Zodiac attack. She was found stabbed multiple times beside her car on a college campus. In April 1967, the Riverside Police Department received a letter claiming responsibility for her murder. In 1970, a letter from someone claiming to be the Zodiac references Bates by name. The connection has been taken seriously by some investigators and then dismissed by others. No definitive link has ever been established. Kathleen Johns was 22 years old and 7 months pregnant when, in March 1970, a man pulled alongside her car on a California highway, flagged her down, and told her one of her rear wheels was wobbling. He loosened the wheel until it fell off, then offered her a ride. She accepted. He drove her in circles for over an hour, refusing to let her out, making strange statements. She eventually managed to escape from the moving car with her infant daughter when he slowed for a turn. When she later described her attacker to police and was shown a wanted poster for the Zodiac, she identified him as a man who had abducted her. The case has never really been formally confirmed as a Zodiac crime, however. The last confirmed letter, 1974. The last letter widely accepted as genuinely from the Zodiac is postmarked January 29, 1974. It is sent to the San Francisco Chronicle and consists largely of a reference to the film The Exorcist, which the writer appears to have found amusing, followed by a tally claiming a victim count of 37. It is signed with the Zodiac's crosshair symbol. After this letter, the confirmed Zodiac correspondence stops. No further murders have been definitively attributed to him. He was never identified. He was never charged. He was never caught. The case remains officially open. So we're going to look at the ciphers, what they reveal and what they conceal. The Zodiac sent 4 ciphers over the course of his correspondence. The first, the 408th cipher, sent in 3 parts to 3 newspapers in August 1969, was solved within days by Donald and Betty Harden of Salinas. As I mentioned, it did not reveal an identity. It revealed what appeared to be a statement about the psychological experience of killing. The second cipher, a 340-symbol cryptogram sent in November of 1969, resisted solution for 51 years. It was finally cracked in December 2020 by a team of amateur code breakers, David Ornchak, a software developer in Virginia, Jarl Van Eyck, a Belgian programmer, and Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician. Working with computational tools unavailable to earlier researchers, the decoded message is rambling and grandiose. It does not name the author. A third cipher, 13 symbols long, has never been solved. A fourth, 32 symbols, has never been solved either. Either they are genuine cryptograms containing real information, or they are deliberately dead ends designed to consume investigative and public attention. We do not know which. The ciphers are central to the cultural mythology of the Zodiac case in a way that I think deserves some examination. They transformed the case from a murder investigation into something that looked to the public like a puzzle, a game, a riddle to be solved. The framing of the case as a code-breaking exercise placed the audience in the position of participant rather than observer, and it positioned the killer as a kind of dark genius whose intellectual superiority was part of the story's appeal. This framing was not the Zodiacs alone. The press adopted it very eagerly, and it had consequences for how the case was covered, how victims were positioned within that coverage, and how the public understood what was actually happening, which was not a game. It was murder. So we're going to apply a sociological lens to the story, and we're going to look at the killer as a media collaborator. The Zodiac case is, among other things, a case study in the relationship between a violent offender and the media ecosystem. And I want to examine this relationship carefully because I think it is one of the most consequential and least examined aspects of the case. The Zodiac did not simply commit murders and write letters about them. He designed a system. He sent letters to multiple newspapers simultaneously so that competitive pressure would guarantee publication. He included portions of cryptograms that the letters had the character of puzzles rather than simple boasts, guaranteeing sustained public engagement. He made threads specific enough to generate fear and vague enough to be impossible to prevent. He timed his letters for maximum impact. He chose a name, the Zodiac, that was mysterious and cinematic and easily reproduced in headlines. He understood with remarkable precision how the media of his era worked. He understood that newspapers competed with each other, that front page placement drove circulation, that a threat against children would produce a qualitatively different public response than a threat against adults, and that maintaining public attention required periodic escalation and novelty. The newspapers, for their part, they made a series of editorial decisions that were individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. They published the letters because the letters contained threats and withholding them might produce more violence. They published the ciphers because readers were fascinated and competitors would publish them if they didn't. They gave the killer a platform not because they were reckless or irresponsible. Most of the editors involved in these decisions were thoughtful people grappling with genuine dilemmas, but because the structure of competitive media in a free society creates incentives that are very difficult to resist when a story is this large. The result was that the Zodiac's correspondence became a running serial narrative. Readers waited for the next letter the way they waited for the next episode of a television program. And within that narrative, the killer was a protagonist. His voice, his intelligence, his demands, his taunts, these were the story. The victims were the supporting characters. The police were antagonists he was outwitting, and the audience was invited to engage with his perspective, to decode his ciphers, to speculate about his identity. This is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of the systems the Zodiac designed and the media adopted. And it established a template for how true crime is told that persists to this day. Fear as a social control in the Bay Area. The immediate sociological effect of the Zodiac's campaign was a transformation of daily life in the Bay Area that I think is often understated in historical accounts of the case. When the threat to shoot school children on their buses was made in October 1969, the response was swift and visceral. School administrators requested police escorts. Parents kept children at home. The threat, which was never acted upon, produced a behavioral change across the entire region that was disproportionate to the actual statistical risk any individual family faced. This is the nature of terrorism, which is what the Zodiac's campaign was, structurally if not politically. The violence itself does not need to be widespread to produce widespread behavioral change. The threat, amplified by media, does the work. The effect on young people in particular were significant. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs Park, Lake Berryessa, these were places teenagers went to be alone, outside of parental supervision, in the ordinary way of adolescence. After the Zodiac attacks, these spaces become associated with danger. The message communicated to young people, particularly to young couples, was that independence and privacy carried mortal risk. This has a gendered dimension worth examining. The primary advisory response to the Zodiac threat, as with the response to other serial killers of the era, was directed at women. Don't be alone. Don't trust strangers. Be aware of your surroundings. Have a man with you. The structural and institutional response, catching the perpetrator, was treated as a separate and slower process. The immediate actionable advice was about restricting the behavior of potential victims. This pattern, advisory responses that place the burden of safety on potential victims rather than on institutional action to identify and stop perpetrators, is one of the most consistent features of societal responses to serial violence in the 20th century. It was not unique to the Zodiac case. But the Zodiac case, because of the intensity and duration of the public fear it generated, makes the pattern unusually visible. And we're going to examine the counterculture, the moral panic, and the interpretation of violence. The Zodiac case emerged at a moment when the American right was constructing a powerful narrative about the counterculture and its relationship to violence. Charles Manson's followers had committed the Tate LaBianca murders in August 1969, less than 2 months before Paul Stine's murder in San Francisco. The two cases were unrelated, but the cultural proximity was impossible to ignore. The rhetoric from conservative political figures in 1960 and 1970 drew a direct line between the counterculture's rejection of traditional values, the breakdown of social order, and the emergence of figures like Manson. California Governor Ronald Reagan, then in his first term, was explicit in his belief that social permissiveness was producing social chaos. The Zodiac, operated in the Bay Area, the symbolic heart of the counterculture, was simplicity incorporated into this narrative, despite the complete absence of any evidence connected him to the counterculture. His targets, after all, were teenagers parked on lovers' lanes and a taxicab driver. He was not targeting the establishment. But moral panics are not constrained by the facts of individual cases. They operate at the level of symbol and anxiety. And the symbol being constructed in late 1969 of California, of the Bay Area, of the era itself as dangerous and out of control, found in the Zodiac a convenient and terrifying illustration. This is worth naming because it shaped policy responses. The law and order politics that Ronald Reagan would perfect nationally in the 1980s were being developed at the state level in California in the early 1970s. And cases like the Zodiacs contributed to the political climate that made those policies viable. The connection is not direct, it is diffuse, atmospheric, the kind of influence that is real but resistant to precise documentation. But it is there. The Zodiac's victims were predominantly white and middle class. The Bay Area communities in which the attacks occurred, Benicia, Vallejo suburban fringes, Napa, Presidio Heights in San Francisco, they were largely white communities. The case generated enormous media coverage in part because the victims were the demographic that the newspaper's readership most readily identified with. In the same period, Black communities in Oakland, Richmond, and San Francisco were experiencing epidemic levels of crime, with significantly less investigative attention, significantly less media coverage, and significantly less political urgency from Sacramento or City Hall. This disparity was not invisible to the communities experiencing it. It was a source of deep and legitimate grievance. In late 1973 and into 1974, the Bay Area was experiencing a wave of murders by a group calling itself the Death Angels, in what the press eventually called the Zebra Murders. A series of attacks on random white San Francisco residents that ultimately killed 15 people and wounded many more. The Zebra Murders are less well known today than the Zodiac case, despite a higher confirmed body count, in part because the narrative framework of the Zodiac, the ciphers, the letters, the symbol, the mystery, made it a more compelling media product. The Zebra Murders were horrific, but did not have a brand. The lesson I draw from this is not that the Zodiac case deserved less attention. It is the allocation of attention in violent crime coverage is shaped by factors that have very little to do with the actual scale of suffering and a great deal to do with the demographics of victims, the narrative packaging of the crime, and the implicit assumptions of media producers about what their audiences find compelling. There is one dimension of the Zodiac's case's sociological legacy that is genuinely unique. The fact that the perpetrator was never identified. This has produced a collective obsession that has now persisted for more than 50 years and shows no sign of diminishing. Dozens of books have been written proposing a specific suspects. Thousands of online forums threads have been dedicated to the case. Multiple documentaries and films have been made, including David Fincher's 2007 film, Zodiac, which is, by any measure, one of the most serious and responsible treatments of the case in any medium. And yet none of this activity has produced a confirmed identification. The case remains unsolved, and the only confirmed major American serial killer case of its era to do so. The psychology of why an unsolved case generates more cultural obsession than a solved one is genuinely interesting. Part of it is a puzzle element I mentioned earlier, the ciphers, the unresolved identity, the sense that there is an answer to be found. Part of it is discomfort with unresolved threat. When a killer is caught and convicted, we can place him in a narrative that has a conclusion. When he is not, the threat remains theoretically present. The story never closes, and humans are, it turns out, very bad at leaving open stories alone. The sociological cost of this obsession is worth naming. The sustained focus on the Zodiac's identity, on who he was, what clues he left behind, which of the dozens of suspects fits the evidence best, has consistently displaced sustained focus on who the victims were, how their families were treated by investigators and the press, what the survivors experienced, and what institutional failures allowed the case to remain unsolved. The victims have become, in the popular imagination, almost entirely defined by their relationship to the killer's narrative. We know them as Zodiac victims. We do not, in most coverage, know them as the full human beings they were. This is a failure of the genre, and I want to try to do something different today. So, what is the political and legal aftermath of the Zodiac's crimes? And we have some investigative failures and their structural causes to examine. The Zodiac investigation was not simply a mystery that investigators failed to solve. It was a series of specific, identifiable institutional failures, each of which had structural causes that extended well beyond the competence or effort of individual investigators. The first and most fundamental failure was jurisdictional fragmentation. The confirmed Zodiac murders occurred in Solano County, Napa County, and the city of San Francisco. Each jurisdiction had its own police department or sheriff's office, its own chain of command, its own investigative priorities, and its own relationship with the press. There was no formal mechanism for integrating the investigations. Information sharing happened informally when individual investigators chose to pick up the phone, and it was also inconsistent. The Vallejo Police Department was the first to directly link the Blue Rock shootings to the Lake Herman Road murders, based on the killer's phone call. But the connection between these Solano County crimes and the Napa County stabbing at Lake Berryessa was slower to be formally established. The San Francisco Police Department, which had a much larger and more bureaucratic structure, integrated the Stine murder into its existing caseload without immediately creating a formal joint task force with the other agencies. This fragmentation was not unique to the Zodiac case. It was a systemic feature of law enforcement in the United States in the late 1960s. But the Zodiac, like Ted Bundy after him, exploited it deliberately. The crosshair symbol drawn on the car door at Lake Berryessa, identifying the attack as this work, was sent not to Napa County investigators, but to the San Francisco Chronicle, because the Zodiac understood that the press would create the connection between the cases faster and more publicly than law enforcement. So, let's look at the Composite and the patrol car encounter. The October of 1969 dispatch error, broadcasting a description of the Stine murder suspect as black, when witnesses had described a white male, is one of the most discussed specific failures in the case. 2 SFPD officers stopped the man in the Presidio shortly after the murder who matched witnesses' description of the Zodiac. They were told by dispatch that the suspect they were looking for fit a different description, and they moved on. They subsequently reported the encounter and were able to describe the man they had stopped. Their description matched the witness's description of the Zodiac. This encounter has been the subject of significant retrospective analysis, including by Robert Graysmith, whose 1968 book Zodiac became the most widely read account of the case. The identity of the man stopped by those officers has never been definitively established. Whether he was a Zodiac is genuinely unknown. What is known is that the dispatch error created the conditions for a potential encounter with the suspect to be abandoned. The composite sketches produced by the Stine witnesses and from Brian Hartnell's description after the Lake Berryessa attack do not perfectly match each other, which has led to continuing debate about whether the composite witnesses were seeing the same person or whether the artist's rendering introduced distortions, or whether the Zodiac deliberately varied his appearance between attacks. None of these questions have been resolved. So let's examine the handwriting, the fingerprints, and the forensic evidence. The Zodiac left behind physical evidence. He left handwriting. He left fingerprints, partial prints that lifted from the cab of Paul Stine's taxi. He left DNA on the stamps and envelopes of his letters, which investigators were eventually able to profile once a DNA analysis became available. He left footprints at crime scenes. None of this evidence has produced a confirmed match to any subject. The suspect has been analyzed by multiple forensic document examiners with inconsistent results. The partial fingerprints have been compared to suspects and not matched. The DNA profile extracted from saliva on stamp and envelope glue has been tested against suspects, but its reliability has been questioned by some investigators because of the possibility of contamination during the decades the letters were handled before DNA analysis became standard practice. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the case from an investigative standpoint. There is evidence. We have evidence. It has simply not been matched to anyone. Either the Zodiac's DNA, fingerprints, and handwriting are not in any database where a match would be registered, or the evidence itself has been degraded or compromised to the point where matches cannot be confirmed, or the most uncomfortable possibility, the suspect who matches this evidence has been eliminated from consideration for reasons that had nothing to do with the evidence. So, what has the Zodiac case changed? Has it changed policy? Has it changed any kind of institutional reforms? The role of the Zodiac in establishing multi-agency communication is one thing we can look at. One of the direct institutional legacies of the Zodiac investigation and of other multi-jurisdictional cases of the same era was pressure to develop formal mechanisms for interagency communication and coordination. California was among the first states to develop a centralized homicide coordination system, and the experience of watching multiple agencies work the same case in isolation was a significant driver of that development. The California Department of Justice's Bureau of Investigation expanded its role in multi-jurisdictional cases in the 1970s, in part as a response to the lessons of cases like the Zodiac. The concept of statewide homicide unit that could coordinate across county and city lines was advocated for by investigators who had worked the Zodiac case and who understood from direct experience how jurisdictional fragmentation enabled a killer to operate. At the federal level, the Zodiac case contributed to the body of evidence that eventually led to the creation of VICAP, which is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, in 1985. I discussed VICAP in the context of the Bundy case in the previous episode, and the two cases are genuinely linked in this regard. Both demonstrated in their different ways that a murderer who understood jurisdictional boundaries could use them as a weapon. VICAP was designed to remove that weapon from future perpetrators. So, how is the press, the police, and the question of publication all factor into this? The Zodiac case forced a public conversation about the responsibilities of the press in the context of active violent crime investigations that has never been fully resolved. The newspapers that published the Zodiac letters did so under genuine threat of further violence. They consulted with investigators in most cases before publication. The Chronicle in particular had an ongoing relationship with the SFPD during the case that involved a significant information sharing in both directions. The editors involved in these decisions were not cavalier about them. And yet the outcome, a killer who was able to use a mainstream press as his personal broadcast medium, who designed his crimes and communications for maximum media impact, who built a public mythology that has outlasted him by more than 5 decades, raises serious questions about whether the decisions made, individually defensible as they were, added up to a responsible collective response. This question has become more acute, not less, in the decades since. The principles that guided newspaper editors in the in 1969, newsworthiness, public safety, competitive pressure, reader interest operate today in an environment of social media and algorithmic amplification that the Zodiac could not have imagined, and that makes the leverage he achieved with these 3 simultaneous letters look quaint. The fundamental question, how do media organizations cover threats and violence without becoming instruments of those threats, has not been answered. It has only become more urgent. Several journalism schools and professional organizations have developed guidelines for the coverage of mass violence and terrorism that attempt to operationalize the lessons of cases like the Zodiac's. The general principle, minimize perpetrator publicity, maximize victim dignity, is broadly accepted. The practice in a competitive digital media environment remains inconsistent, however. So how do we involve the development of criminal profiling into the Zodiac crime? The Zodiac was one of the first cases studied by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit as it developed what would have become criminal profiling. The BSU's agents found the Zodiac case both instructive and confounding. The killer's behavior did not fit neatly into the typologies they were developing from interviews with incarcerated offenders, in part because the Zodiac's primary motivation appeared to include, perhaps even to center, the public correspondence campaign rather than the killings themselves. Most of the serial killers the BSU studied in this period killed for motivations that were primarily related to the act of killing, the control, the violence, the fantasy. The Zodiac appeared to derive significant satisfaction from the publicity, the public fear, and the sense of power over investigators and the press that his letter-writing campaign provided. This has made him an important data point in the development of what would later be categorized as the power control motivational type, while also suggesting a variant of that type in which public performance and media manipulation were central to the offender's psychology. The profiling analysis conducted on the Zodiac in the early 1970s described a white male, likely in his late 20s to late 30s at the time of the confirmed attacks, of above-average intelligence, likely organized in his professional and personal life, with a need for public attention and a sophisticated understanding of media dynamics. This profile was consistent with many of the serious aspects investigated over the decades that followed. It was also consistent with a very large number of people who were never the Zodiac. The limits of profiling as an investigative tool are clearly visible in the Zodiac case. The profile did not narrow the field of suspects to a manageable number. It described a type, not an individual, and the investment of significant investigative resources in profile-based suspect analysis may have contributed to the exclusion or deprioritization of suspects who fit the evidence but did not fit the profile's expected presentation. So what about the victims' rights and the treatment of survivors regarding the Zodiac's murders? Well, Brian Hartnell, who survived the Lake Berryessa attack, and Michael Mageau, who survived the Blue Rock Springs shooting, were both living with the long-term consequences of the Zodiac's violence before any formal victims' rights framework existed to support them. The treatment of surviving witnesses and victims' families in the Zodiac case was consistent with the norms of the era. Victims and survivors were treated primarily as sources of evidentiary information to be interviewed by investigators, then largely left to manage their experiences on their own. There was no victim advocate assigned to their cases, no formal counseling provision, no systematic notification of developments in the investigation. Families of victims learned about new letters and new suspects from newspapers like everyone else. This is the context in which the victims' rights movement of the 1970s and 1980s developed. and which I discussed in more detail in the previous episode. The movement's success, the Victims of Crime Act, the Crime Victims' Right Act, state constitutional amendments came too late for the Zodiac victims. But the suffering of people like the Farron family, the Faraday family, the Stine family, and the surviving victims themselves contributed to the evidence that the movement drew on. It's making its case that the system was failing the people it needed to serve. And what about the promise of modern forensics and DNA in particular? In the decades since the Zodiac's last confirmed letter, forensic science has been transformed. DNA analysis, which was not available to investigators until the late 1980s, has closed hundreds of cold cases across the United States and is now combined with genealogical database searching, which is a technique used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, to identify suspects in cases where the perpetrator's DNA is known but has never been matched to a named individual. The Zodiac case has been examined in the context of this new capabilities. The Vallejo Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the San Francisco Police Department have all conducted DNA analysis on letters and envelopes attributed to the Zodiac at various points since the technology became available. The results have been inconsistent, in part because of the handling and the age of materials, and in part because of questions about which letters are genuine and which may be forgeries. Investigators have stated publicly that a usable DNA profile has been extracted from some of the letters. Whether genealogical database searching has been applied to their profile and what those searches have produced, if so, has not been publicly confirmed as of the time of this recording. The Zodiac case remains active in all relevant jurisdictions. The Golden State Killer identification in 2018, in which investigators identified Joseph James DeAngelo using his relatives' DNA profiles, voluntarily submitted to genealogical databases, then confirmed his identity through a direct DNA sample, demonstrated that cases long considered unsolvable are not necessarily unsolvable, only waiting for the right technology. Whether the Zodiac case will be resolved through these methods remains genuinely unknown, but the possibility exists in a way it did not 20 years ago. And for the families of the victims, that possibility, however uncertain, is not nothing. What do we know of the psychology of this unknown subject, the Zodiac? Here's what we can and cannot say about the Zodiac. Discussing the psychology of the Zodiac presents a challenge that does not exist in the same form for any other major case I've covered on this podcast. The subject has never been identified. We do not know his name. We do not know his age, his occupation. We don't know his personal history or his eventual fate. We only know what he chose to reveal in those letters and what can be inferred from the documented attacks. Everything I'm about to say should be understood with that limitation firmly in mind. Psychological analysis of an unknown offender based on crime scene behavior and written communications is a genuinely useful investigative tool. It is not a definitive portrait. The conclusions that follow are informed by the research literature on serial violence, by the profiling work done on the Zodiac case by investigators over the past 5 decades, and by my own synthesis of that material. They are not facts. They are, however, informed assessments. With that caveat clearly in place, what does the documented behavior of the Zodiac suggest about his psychology? So, the most distinctive feature of the Zodiac's behavior, the feature that makes him genuinely unusual in the history of serial crime, is the centrality of the correspondence campaign to his criminal activity. Most serial killers keep their crimes as private as possible. The Zodiac advertised his. He designed a public identity, maintained it over the years, and appeared to derive as much or more satisfaction from the correspondence as from the killings themselves. The confirmed murders ended apparently around 1969. The letters continued until 1974. If the murders were the primary source of whatever psychological satisfaction drove his behavior, we would expect the letters to stop when the murders stopped. Instead, the inverse appears to have happened. The letters continued after the murders ceased, suggesting that the publicity campaign was, for this individual, the more essential activity. This is consistent with what clinicians describe as a narcissistic orientation in which public attention, power, and the sense of controlling others' emotions and behavior are the primary drivers. The violence may have been, in part, instrumental, a means of generating the attention and fear that the publicity campaign required, rather than an end in itself. This interpretation is supported by the escalation of the threat rhetoric in the letters. Claimed victim counts rising from 5 to 37, bomb threats, the threats against school children, even as the confirmed killings appear to have stopped. What do we know about the Zodiac's intelligence, whether he was very organized, or how he functioned in society? And the Zodiac letters we can say that they are grammatically deliberate, occasionally witty in a dark and self-satisfied way, and they demonstrate familiarity with opera, film, and astrology. The ciphers he constructed, at least the two that have been solved, show competence with basic cryptographic principles, though not the advanced expertise that popular accounts sometimes attribute to him. The 408 cipher solved in days by two amateur code breakers is not a masterwork of encryption. What the letters suggest is someone of above average intelligence, who is well read, who has thought carefully about how to achieve public impact, and who is capable of sustained, goal-directed behavior over a period of years. These characteristics are consistent with someone who is on the surface functional in everyday life. Someone who is employed, probably in a position requiring some technical competence, able to maintain ordinary social relationships at least superficially. The deliberate use of multiple jurisdictions, the timing of attacks for maximum investigative difficulty, the careful management of physical evidence, wiping down the cab interior, collecting pieces of victims' clothing as trophies that could later be included in letters as authentication, all suggest organized, premeditated behavior rather than impulsive violence. This is consistent with an individual who was not experiencing acute psychotic symptoms, who could plan and execute over time, and who was able to resume normal life between the attacks. We ask ourselves these questions. Why didn't he stop? And why did he? Two questions about the Zodiac's behavior have occupied investigators and researchers for decades. Again, why did the confirmed killings apparently stop in late 1969? And why did the letters eventually stop in 1974? And from this, several hypotheses have been advanced for the cessation of the killings. The Zodiac, it is believed, may have been incarcerated for another offense. He may have died. He may have moved out of the Bay Area. He may have been deterred by the increased investigative attention following the Paul Stine murder in San Francisco, which brought significantly more resources to bear than the earlier cases had. He may have concluded that the publicity campaign was satisfying his needs without the risks of further killings. The cessation of the letters in 1974 is similarly open to multiple interpretations. The sustained public attention may have diminished enough that the letters no longer produce a response they had in 1969 and 1970. He may have become ill or died. He may have decided that the accumulated mythology was sufficient and that further communication would only risk without commensurate reward. He may have simply moved on. And I want to sit with that for a moment because I think the culture's discomfort with not knowing We do not know. And I want to sit with that for a moment because I think the culture's discomfort with not knowing, the compulsive need to fill the gap with a theory, a suspect, a resolution, is itself worth examining. The Zodiac case is unsolved. It may remain unsolved, and the inability to accept that outcome, to understand it as a form of ongoing justice, rather than a puzzle awaiting a clever solution, says something about how we relate to violent crime, to mystery, and to the suffering of victims whose cases do not get the satisfaction of resolution in the end. We've come to this segment in the story, the victims' names. I want to say their names and tell you something about each one of them, not as entries in a case file, not as the Zodiac's victims, but as people. The tendency in coverage of this case is to name them once and then move on to the ciphers, to the letters, the suspects, the theory. I am going to resist that tendency. David Arthur Faraday. He was 17 years old. He was a high school senior at Vallejo's Hogan High School, where he was a member of the wrestling team. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a quiet and steady young man who had worked hard for everything he had. He was on his first date with Betty Lou Jensen on the night he was killed. He was shot beside his car on a dark road outside Benicia on December 20th, 1968. He was the age of a high school junior, the age at which most people are still figuring out the shape of their futures. Betty Lou Jensen, she was 16 years old. She was a sophomore at Vallejo's Hogan High School, the school she shared with David Faraday. She was, by family accounts, a bright and social young woman with a lot of plans. She was shot 5 times in the back as she ran from the car. She ran 280 feet before she was found. That detail has stayed with investigators and family members for more than 50 years. She was 16 years old. Darlene Elizabeth Farron. She was 22 years old. She was a waitress at a restaurant in Vallejo where she was known for her warmth and her ability to remember every customer's usual order. She had a daughter who was not yet 2 years old when Darlene was killed. She had a husband. She had a wide circle of friends who have spent decades insisting in interviews and in her memory that she was more than a Zodiac victim, that she was a fully realized human being with a life that mattered on its own terms. She was shot multiple times while parked at Blue Rock Springs Park on July 4th, 1969. She died at the hospital. Her daughter grew up without her. Michael Renaud Majot. He was 19 years old when he was shot at Blue Rock Springs alongside Darlene Farron. He survived with serious wounds to his neck, face, and legs. He survived. But survival is not a clean word. Michael Majot carried the physical and psychological consequences of that night for the rest of his life. He became a key witness in the case, providing the most direct surviving victim description of the Zodiac's face and manner. He has spoken publicly about the attack at various points over the decades. He described in later interviews a man who seemed calm, deliberate, not in a hurry. That detail is in many ways more terrifying than the violence itself. Cecilia Ann Shepard. She was 22 years old. She was a student at Pacific Union College, a music major, and someone her family and friends consistently described as one of the most genuinely kind people they had ever known. She was stabbed 10 times at Lake Berryessa on September the 27th, 1969, while picnicking with her boyfriend Brian Hartnell. She survived the attack for 2 days and died in a hospital in Napa on September the 29th. She was 22 years old. She had been studying music. She had been planning to teach. She had a whole life that was described to investigators by a grief-stricken circle of people who wanted her to be known as more than the circumstance of her death. Brian Calvin Hartnell. He was 20 years old when he was stabbed 6 times at Lake Berryessa. He survived. He has spoken publicly about the attack, about Cecilia, and about what it means to carry a case like this through a lifetime. He became, in some ways, the most articulate surviving witness to the Zodiac's behavior. His account of the conversation before the attack, of the man's calm demeanor and methodical preparation, has been central to every serious analysis of the Zodiac psychology. He has also spent decades trying to ensure that Cecilia is remembered as a person rather than as a crime scene data point. Paul Lee Stine. He was 29 years old. He was a graduate student at San Francisco State University, working on his degree while supporting himself by driving a taxi cab. He was shot once in the right side of the head on the night of October 11, 1969, by a passenger who then stole a piece of his shirt. He had done nothing except drive a cab and make the ordinary human error of picking up a passenger who seemed unremarkable. His murder brought the Zodiac case into San Francisco and into a new phase of public attention. He is often discussed primarily as a victim whose murder generated the most leads. He deserves to be remembered as a person who was working toward a degree, who had a life and a future, and who was killed because he was in the wrong car at the wrong moment. There are others. Cheri Jo Bates, 18 years old, killed at River City College in 1966 in an attack that may or may not be connected to the Zodiac. Kathleen Johns, 20 years old and 7 months pregnant, who survived an abduction in 1970 that she later identified as a Zodiac attack. The unnamed individuals a Zodiac claimed in his letters to have killed, whose existence has never been confirmed or denied. The families of all these people who have lived for more than 50 years without the resolution that a conviction would have brought. The case being unsolved does not make the suffering of these families less real. It makes it, in some ways, more real, because there is no verdict that provides the legal acknowledgement that what was done to their loved ones has been accounted for. The grief is the same. The injustice has no conclusion. I've been thinking about what is genuinely distinctive about this case as compared to the others I've covered, and I keep coming back to the same thing, to the same realization. The Zodiac case is not about the Zodiac. It never was. It is about what an entire society chose to do when confronted with a killer who offered himself as a mystery rather than simply a murderer. The choice to treat him as a puzzle rather than a perpetrator, to center the ciphers, the brand, the identity question, rather than the victims and the institutional failures, was not made by one person or one newspaper. It was a cumulative outcome of thousands of individual decisions made by editors, investigators, documentary producers, authors, and eventually podcasters across more than 50 years. Every one of us who has covered this case has inherited a narrative frame that puts the unknown killer at the center. And most of us, including me, have struggled to genuinely displace that frame rather than simply acknowledge it and then reproduce it anyway. What I want you to take from this episode is not a theory about who the Zodiac was, is an understanding of what the case reveals about the systems in which it occurred, the fragmented law enforcement architecture that made multi-jurisdictional coordination nearly impossible back then, The competitive media dynamics, it turned a killer's correspondence into a circulation event. The gendered response to public threat that placed the burden of safety on the potential victims. The racial disparities in whose fear gets covered and whose violence gets resources. And the profound unresolved injustice of a case in which 5 people were murdered, several more were wounded, and no one has ever been held accountable to this day. The families of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stine deserve better than a mythology. They deserve an accounting. Whether the technology of the next decade will finally provide one, I genuinely do not know. What I do know is that the case is not closed. The families are still waiting, and the sustained public fascination with the killer's identity has, for 5 decades, consumed far more cultural energy than sustained public concern for the people he killed. I hope this episode has, in some small way, shifted that balance. If you found value in today's episode, please share it. If you have been affected by violent crime and would like to support, the resources in the show's notes include the National Center for Victims of Crime and Crisis Text Line. If you are a researcher, journalist, law enforcement professional, or family member with information relevant to the Zodiac case, contact information for the relevant agencies is also linked. Next time on ZeitCrimes, we continue into the 1980s and a case that would force the country to finally confront serial violence, not as a collection of isolated tragedies, but as a systemic failure demanding a systemic response. I'll see you then.